Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate the opportunity to have this discussion. And really, I want to point out the work that we've laid out here is exactly that. With the CorePace Research Partnership, one of our primary goals is to put research evidence into policy conversations. And so we hope that with all of you from the diverse organizations that you represent, we can have a conversation about what this analysis means, how it can be extended, and how to make sense of it for smart policy making. Before I get started, I want to introduce a couple of people in the room. This is Emily Penner, who's a co-author on the paper, and Joe Witte, who's the other co-author. And we also have our partners here from PACE. We have Rick Miller and Julie White, who are here for the discussion period as well. So if you have questions throughout, specifically for CORE, you can make note of those because we have some representatives here. So just stepping back and talking for a minute about the CorePace partnership and what our goals are. From its inception, we've always envisioned that we would be looking at continuous improvement for the core districts, helping them to make sense of the data that they've collected together across the districts for continuous improvement within each of the districts and across the collaboration. But simultaneously, to always be thinking about how what we're learning in the core districts can inform smart policy making, both in Sacramento, in other districts across the state, and also with this important policy transition in Washington. And so we have a really diverse audience for the kind of work that we do with the CorePace Research Partnership. With this particular piece, the focus is on the smart policy making that, as I'll discuss in a bit, ESSA and the regulations really presented some need for empirical work to be able to shed light on policy trade-offs. And so that's the primary audience for this particular analysis. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with ESSA and the monumental shift that it makes, but there really is a strong shift from a federal role to a state and local role in both measuring what a performance looks like, what good performance looks like in schools, but also how those schools are intervened upon and with, and what support and improvement looks like. And that was, I'd say, the primary spirit of ESSA was in shifting that balance of power. This report that we put out is really specifically in response to the ESSA draft regulations, which were released on May 31st, 2016. And as I'm sure many of you are familiar, the timeline is very accelerated. And this is why right now we need to be having these conversations about identification of schools. ESSA was signed in December of 2015 with, in the 15-16 school year, ongoing decision making in at the federal and state level. The ESEA waivers just concluded this month. Next year is a transition year with full implementation underway in 2017-18. So for those of you that are really involved in this process in California, you know that the decisions are being made about what this is going to look like right now. And so we're hoping to contribute to that conversation as well. So in this paper, our primary focus is the set of required measures under ESSA. And as many of you know, multiple measures under ESSA is a really big deal. Under No Child Left Behind, the measurement of just test scores led to some negative consequences: narrowing of the curriculum toward tested subjects and content, gaming of accountability structures, and cheating on those particular measures. And a big part of what ESSA is aiming to do is to say, let's expand that measurement so that we can really be looking at all of the things that we think schools should be held accountable for and that we think schools do for our schools, our communities, and our students. And let's expand that measurement. So ESSA specifies a set of measures with state flexibility within to determine exactly how those measures are operationalized. In elementary and middle schools, this includes annual academic achievement in ELA and mathematics that in the draft regulations are specified as % proficient. Although there's some disagreement about if that's the best way to proceed. Also, either a measure of academic growth in both ELA and math or another academic measure. Also English proficiency, and something called the School Quality and Student Success Indicator, which can be anything from student engagement, educator engagement, student access to advanced coursework, post-secondary readiness, school climate and safety. So sometimes referred to as the fifth indicator. This is a pretty open bucket. In high schools, the measures are similar, except academic growth is optional. Graduation rate, a four-year cohort graduation rate has to be included, also English proficiency and this school quality and student success measure. And so this multiple measures and what we make of that under ESSA is really the focus of this piece. The elements that we explore in this analysis are threefold. First, we look at the identification of schools for comprehensive support and improvement using multiple measures, and we'll talk about specifically what the draft regulations lay out in a second. Second, we talk about how this school quality and student success measure, abbreviated here as SQSS, and some of the slides that follow can be included in this identification system. And finally, a brief analysis on how schools can be identified for targeted support and improvement. So it's important to note here that identifying schools for comprehensive support and improvement and targeted support and improvement is really only a small part of what multiple measures should be used for. Ultimately, we want to engage many stakeholder groups across the state and across the country in the conversation about what good school performance looks like and if our schools are meeting those high expectations. This really, I think, is emphasized by the core district's focus on data as a flashlight and not a hammer, that multiple measures and having multiple measures enables you to look at schools in a very robust and comprehensive way. Yet, the CSI and TSI identifications are very high stakes. And in California, where we have a lot of schools, it's a lot of schools that will be identified for comprehensive support and improvement, and also, as you'll see later, targeted support and improvement. Also, schools get $500,000 for a CSI and $50,000 for TSI. So it's not inconsequential at all, even though it is just a small part, ultimately, of what these measures should be used for. So the core districts, which is where we've done this analysis, are an ideal set of districts for shedding light on policy trade-offs because really they're ahead of the curve on measurement. So I'm going to step back for a second and talk about who the core districts are, and then I'll talk about the specific measures that we use. So the core districts are a collaborative of 8 California school districts. 6 of those received a waiver from the federal government under No Child Left Behind to implement their own accountability system. The core districts represent 1 million students in California, and the core districts in this analysis, these 6 school districts, have 923 Title I schools, which actually is more than 26 states. So the core districts alone are larger than many of the states in the country, which I think makes them an interesting case for exploring some of these trade-offs. We only used a subset of CORE's measures in this analysis, in large part to simplify the story, but also to adhere very closely to what ESSA requires. So as we discussed before, ESSA requires a measure of academic performance, academic growth, graduate, and English language proficiency. For the core measures, we used academic performance, a composite of ELA and mathematics, proficiency. For academic growth, we used CORE's preliminary growth model, that utilizes students' growth from one year to the next, comparing them to other similar students with similar demographics and similar test scores in a prior year. We also use the 4-year adjusted cohort rate and English proficiency as defined by the core districts, which is actually EL redesignation, so it's a little bit different than what's being discussed in California. But provides some illustrations for how it could work out here in identification. For the bucket of indicators in the school quality and student success, the core districts, the measures that we use here are chronic absence, which is defined as the percent of students who are not in school 10% or more of the time. We use suspension and expulsion rates. And then these 2 elements here are something that are very unique to the core districts, which is that students in the schools have been surveyed on their social emotional skills and their school culture and climate. So this is all students in grades 5 through 12. And these measures are growth mindset, self-efficacy, self-management, and social awareness in the social emotional domain. And in the culture climate domain, this is the climate of support for academic learning, knowledge and perceived fairness of discipline, rules, and norms, school safety, and sense of belonging and school connectedness. And so what we do with these set of measures is pull them in to consider how these 4 measures could be utilized as school quality and student success metrics. So let's just jump right into it. The ESSA elements that are explored in this analysis, first we're going to start with how these multiple measures can be used for identifying schools for CSI. Now, I want to say that we're focusing here in this first question on the academic measures, in large part because ESSA puts a lot more weight on the academic measures than on this SQSS, which I'll talk about in just a second here. So stepping back, the ESSA regulations, the draft ESSA regulations stipulate that academic measures must be aggregated into a single summative score to be used in identifying schools, but provide some flexibility on what that summative score can look like. They're a little bit vague about exactly how that summative score needs to be created. There's some language in there that says there have to be at least 3 levels, and in conversations around the summative score, there's been a lot of disagreement even at the federal about the intentions and how regulation should go forward. These 4 academic components must be afforded substantial weight individually and much greater weight than the SQSS component. And one of the ways that that's laid out is that the regulations say that SQSS measures can't remove schools from CSI identification that would have otherwise been included with the academic measures. So for that reason, we focus just on the academic measures in the first part of the paper and exploring how those are related to one another. ESSA draft regulations also specify that schools should be identified for comprehensive support and improvement at least once every 3 years if they're in the bottom 5% of Title I schools on this summative score, or if they have a 4-year adjusted cohort graduation rate below 67%. So this is the set of elements from ESSA that we explore in some of these trade-offs. So in thinking through how these measures come together into a summative score, the first thing that we wanted to do was explore how they're related to one another. So to give you an example, this is a scatter plot comparing academic performance and academic growth. And what we show here is how schools are identified in the bottom 5% on both of these indicators. So what you see is that on academic performance and academic growth, actually I have it's not quite up there, so no I don't. The red dots are schools that are in the bottom 5% on both of these indicators. The blue dots are schools that are in the bottom 5% on just academic performance, and the yellow dots are those that are in the bottom 5% on just academic growth. So what you'll see from this, I think there's 2 important lessons here, are that there's a lot of fanning. These are not measuring exactly the same thing across all levels of performance. But there's also a lot of difference in which schools are identified in the bottom 5%. In fact, only 13% of schools are identified among the bottom 5% by both of these measures, of the schools that are identified by either measure. So we expanded this to look at, across all of these measures in pairwise comparisons, what % of schools are similarly identified. And each of these would have a scatter plot that looks something like the other one that you just saw. So to give you 2 examples, graduation rate and academic performance, only 14% of those schools are similarly identified in the bottom 5%. On EL proficiency and academic performance, only 4% of those schools are identified similarly in the bottom 5%. And we see that the range is from 4 to 14, but they're all relatively low, indicating really that these different measures are measuring different dimensions of school quality in the core districts. And another important point is that less than 1% of schools is in the bottom 5% on every single one of these measures. So we don't have a large group of schools that is just always low on all of these measures. This is another way to emphasize that this is something that these are measuring different dimensions of school quality. So in order to unpack this a little bit, so now that we know the schools are, that schools are not always consistently high or consistently low on these measures, how can we think about including them in a definition system for comprehensive support and improvement? So we look at 3 alternatives. And I think it's really important to note that these are illustrations. By no means are they exhaustive. Even within the illustrations that we provide, there's a lot of room for further empirical work, which we think would be fantastic to pursue. But the three options that we explore are first, identifying schools using an equally weighted continuous summative score. Second, adjusting for low performance in the use of indicators. And third, using the full set of indicators to create decision rules about identification. You're using what we're calling a tiered approach. So first, we're going to look at how we would identify schools using this equally weighted summative score. So just to give you a sense of how we calculated this score, we used an equal weighting We standardized each of the 4 academic measures and then used an equal weighting to produce this summative score. It ends up looking something like this. It's continuous, and there's a particular cut point here at which schools below that cut point are identified for comprehensive support and improvement, and schools above that cut point are not. And what these little squigglies here indicate is that there are many more schools below and schools after as well. So this is just focusing in on this cut point here. So what I think is important to note about this cut is that the division is between schools with a score of 19.29 and schools with a score of 19.33. And so it really just, I think it highlights the arbitrariness of a cut, but it also highlights the arbitrariness of 5% at all. And this is something that we probably won't change. 5% has been around for a long time, but it doesn't shed a lot of light on, is this school actually better, this 19.33 school, than a 19.29 school? How do we think about what that school actually needs? The arbitrariness of this measure is highlighted when we pull in some of the individual measures that were used to identify those schools. So what you see here, and we'll get into this in a second in a little bit more rigorous way, but this is these schools with color coding to show on the academic performance, academic growth, and EL proficiency, and this is just for elementary schools, if they're in the bottom 2.5% on that indicator, the bottom 5%, the bottom 10%, or if they're above the bottom 10%. And this just shows, I think the rainbow shows that there are schools that are doing really well and really poorly on things on the identified side of that cut, and also on the not identified side of that cut. So we have schools here that are in the bottom 2.5% on academic growth who are not identified for comprehensive support and improvement. And so some of this exploratory work is what led us to start exploring some other ways that we might be able to model identifying schools not based on this summative score cut point. So one of the ways that we did this is by looking at schools that are in the bottom 5% of any individual indicator. What percentage of those are identified by the summative score? So what we see here is that of the schools that are identified in the bottom 5% on academic performance, only 40% of those are identified using the summative score. Similarly, for academic growth, if they're in the bottom 5% on academic growth, only 45% of those schools are identified for comprehensive support and improvement, 22% for EL proficiency, and 38% for graduation. So I think the really important thing to note from this is, again, these are measuring different things, and the summative score by definition, as an average, kind of evens out some of that acute low performance. However, on the other hand, let's see, 14% of the schools, this is an important point. 14% of the schools that are in the bottom 5% on any one indicator, only 71% of those are not identified in the bottom 5% by the summative score. So if a school is low on a particular item, they're more often than not identified for comprehensive support and intervention. On the other hand, though, what the summative score is good at is identifying schools that are really low on everything. So what we see here is that 1% of schools are in the bottom 5% on all of the individual indicators, and all of those schools are identified. So it's not very many, but all of them are identified by the summative score. An additional 1% of schools are in the bottom 5 to 10% on individual indicators, and also 100% of those are identified using the summative score. Where it gets a little bit more questionable, where we might say, is this what we actually want from a policy perspective, is that 5% of schools are in the bottom 20% on all individual indicators, and the majority of those are identified using the summative score. So to put this a different way, what we're seeing is that even kind of moderately low performance, the summative score is picking up on those on those schools and including them for comprehensive support. But as I showed in the previous chart, that's not the case with the schools that are acutely low on a particular thing. I think the really important thing to point out here is that whether you go with a summative score or something else is really a value judgment that you could make a case for using a summative score, that as many of you know, there are arguments about transparency, there are arguments about communication. There are also arguments that, as we show by these two things, it really is picking up schools that are low on everything. But the question here is, when we get to this point, how do we think schools should be selected for comprehensive support and improvement? And we like to use an analogy of a school counselor, that if a school counselor has limited resources and is deciding which students to provide support to, it makes total sense that that person should apply her time to students that are failing every class, of course. But what about students that have C's in most classes and a D and an F? How should she think about whether she should intervene with students that have all D's, or whether she should intervene with students that have C's, D's, and F's? And that's where this value judgment really comes in. And so what we wanted to do next is to explore some of the ways that you could look at these acute low levels of performance in the context of identification as a potential alternative. So we'll move on to that now, adjusting for low performance in the use of indicators. So one option that we explore in the paper is using criterion-referenced cuts, something similar to what ESSA requires for graduation rate. So ESSA requires that if schools have a graduation rate less than 67%, that they're included for identification. So to illustrate how this might work, again, we have this scatter plot that shows the summative score compared to graduation. Again, the red dots show that these are schools that would be identified in the bottom 5% on both measures. The yellow dots are those that would be identified by the summative score. And then the blue dots here are the additional schools that would be identified with this 67% graduation rate. And so what we show is that these blue schools add 9% of schools to CSI identification for a total of 14% of schools identified, which is important to think about for California state policy, that threshold will identify most likely even more than 14%, because this doesn't include alternative schools, which have to be included under ESSA. But it also points out the challenge with a criterion reference, which is that it's really hard to know from a resource allocation perspective how many schools will be identified in a particular year. On the other hand, the upside of that is that it's very clear what that level of performance is for stakeholders, for communities, for the school, the educators in the schools themselves. This is the point that I'm trying to reach, to avoid identification or to make sure that I'm doing right by my students. So we explored a couple of other options for how we might overweight low performance. And one of those is that we could select schools to get to 5%. We could select schools that are in the bottom X% on any given indicator to get to the 5% cut point. And so what we did with this is we played around with what percentage of schools, what percentage on individual indicators would we have to set that bar at to get 5%. And what we found is that it would have to be schools in the bottom 2% for elementary schools on any given indicator, in the bottom 1% on any given indicator in middle and high schools. So if a policymaker wanted to overweight low performance on a particular indicator, that's one way they could do it. The other way is that instead of equal weighting across the measures, which is what we did in our summative score, you could kind of double weight schools that are below a certain performance threshold as a way to continue to have a summative score, but to overweight that so that schools that had acutely low levels of performance had a better chance of being identified. So we just played with a couple of thought experiments really there on how we could get away with some of the problems we saw in the summative score. And then another option that we explored is this idea of a tiered approach and using the full set of indicators. What we found was valuable about this approach, which I'll go into in detail, is that it enables any policymaker or any state system to be able to look at the data in a more comprehensive way, not kind of boiling it down to a single number, but saying, I'm going to use a set of clearly defined decision rules for how we identify students or schools for comprehensive support and intervention. So as an illustration, we started with two academic indicators, academic performance and academic growth. And for this analysis that we show here, we utilized the core data's method of identifying schools into a rating system of 1 to 10 on individual indicators. And so what we did is we said acute performance is if a school is at level 1, and then below average is if you're 2, 3, average is if you're 4, 5, 6, and then above average is if you're 7, 8, 9. I think I got that right, 8, 9, 10. And so in this thought experiment, what we did is we said, On these two dimensions, which are nice for an illustration because they're related, right? They're based on similar data, and we're saying schools can have high test scores but low growth or vice versa. And so what we said here is that if a school has low academic performance and low academic growth, their students are not performing, they're not showing movement on that, those are schools that we probably need to intervene on. 2% of schools fall into this box. They probably need comprehensive support and improvement. But then we have a lot of schools, 15% actually, in this orange category, where maybe they have acute levels of academic growth, they're not growing quickly, but their academic performance is below average, average, or above average. And up here, same thing, that they might have really low performance, but some of them might have pretty high growth. So we're not sure how we want to think about, or averagely high growth. We're not sure how we want to think about this. And I think this is another point to pause and say this is super arbitrary, right? That as a leader of a school system, you would look at this and say any school that's acute on academic growth probably needs something. Any school that's acute on academic performance probably needs support. And so again, this is where 5% is not 5% of schools get something and 95% of schools get nothing. Right? It's just really focusing on the idea that 5% of schools get comprehensive support and improvement under ESSA. And so that's, a particular way that we need to focus. So in going through this, we thought about these, the red, the orange, the yellow, and the green, and putting these out of our minds for right now. These are, again, schools that might need support and improvement in some more casual way, but for the purposes of ESSA, CSI, we're going to say these schools are okay. We're going to disregard them for right now. So we brought these color codes into a decision tree and said, these red schools are identified. If you're acutely low on both measures, you need comprehensive support and improvement. But what if you're orange? Now this is where we can kind of dig into those schools a little bit more. We looked at EL proficiency as the next tier and said, of those schools that are in that orange category, how are they performing on EL proficiency? And part of the reason why we did this in this way is because not all schools have ELs, so not all schools have EL proficiency. And again, just as an illustration, but what we found is of those 15% of schools, 2% of them are at the acute level. So we would identify those schools. We would say you're orange on academic performance and growth, and your EL proficiency is really low. You could also choose to identify the additional 2%, saying, look, this should identify you no matter what, but you're below average on both of these things, so maybe we should identify you there as well. So just a way of thinking through all of the information in each of the indicators, again, kind of akin to a counselor who might say, if I'm comparing two students, one with all Ds and one with all Fs and one with Cs and Fs, I'm going to take into account all of the information I can about that student to know what kinds of supports he or she needs, what her other contextual, like what it's like at home, is she coming to school, kind of the whole set of things that would help you identify what that student needs most. And as we'll discuss, school quality and student success is another set of indicators that could be used here in this triage decision process. So we'll turn to that next, the inclusion of the school quality and student success indicators. So again, as with the academic indicators, what we wanted to do first is to compare how the summative score is related to each of the SQSS measures and how each of those SQSS measures are related to one another. So again, trying to understand how are these things working simultaneously. This should be familiar by now, but what we're showing here is the summative score on the x-axis, the social emotional skills surveys on the y-axis, and this is the percent of students reporting positive responses on social emotional skills. And we see that the red dots are those that are in the bottom 5% on both, the yellow dots are those that are in the bottom 5% just on social emotional skills, and the blue are those that are in the bottom 5% just on the summative score. So as with the academic indicators, we find that only 9% of schools are similarly identified on these two dimensions. We then look at a similar pairwise comparison and again find pretty low similarities both within the SQSS measures and also with the summative academic measure. So suspension and expulsion and chronic absence, for example, are related. 16% of those schools are similarly identified in the bottom 5% on those two individual metrics. And then when we look at summative academic, the lowest relationship here is with suspension and expulsion at 6%, but they're all kind of hovered here between 6 and 11. And so this is, I think this is something that has come up that, well, would this be valuable, could we use these then under ESSA? Because ESSA requires that these SQSS measures predict outcomes that we care about, like college and career readiness. And I want to point out that this doesn't actually refute that. All of these measures, and the reason why we chose these is because at the student level, they have been validated. So we know at the student level, these things predict performance. What this is showing us is that at the school level, schools have different effects on these things, or the distribution within these things is different. And I think that's a really important point to make, is that these multiple measures are really measuring different dimensions of student performance. So the ESSA regulations specify that the SQSS measures can't remove a school from CSI that would otherwise have been identified. So that leaves states with two options. First, they can include schools that are identified under either the academic and SQSS measures, which, as we showed in that scatter plot and similarity table, means that we would have substantially more than 5% of schools identified. No matter how much you weighted those. Even if you weighted them very low, it would identify more than 5% by definition. The other option is that states could weight these SQSS indicators at less than 1%. So our analysis showed that if you weighted these measures even at 1%, it changed the identification of schools. So if we read the ESSA regulations and we take them very literally, this means that you can't put any weight on the SQSS measures without including them, without changing the identification of schools. And I think it's just important to stop again and say, this is hugely problematic. The change from No Child Left Behind to ESSA was really because there was a groundswell against the focus on just test scores. And you know, this played out in a lot of ways. It played out at the parent level, it played out in the community level, and I think more than anything else, it played out at the school level. And we've heard from educators in the core districts as well that the focus on multiple measures has enabled them to say, let's bring everyone to the table, that we don't only care about ELA and math here. Now we actually are being held accountable for getting students to school, for making this a safe environment. And it's changed the way they think about who contributes to school quality. And so if that's what we want to see happening, then not weighting these, research has shown us that not weighting these will not put any attention onto these measures by those stakeholder groups that we really care about, and by these measures that we really care about. So we thought of a different way to include the SQSS measures back into this tiered approach. So back to this orange group, the 15%. Looking at the school quality and student success measures, we thought of a way that we could now say, well, what if the schools are doing really badly on these different pieces? Or alternatively, you could think, what if they're doing really well? So you could kind of think about this in a couple of different ways. But the idea being, if a school is in this orange category, but their students are coming to school, their suspension rates are where you would expect or hope them to be, or their disproportionality is where you might expect or hope it to be. And students are exhibiting strong social emotional skills, they feel safe, and they feel like they belong at school. You could imagine that being enough to say, maybe we'll wait and see if this school is on the right track, is on an improvement track. And instead, we're going to focus just on these places where these other things are really problematic too. And so what I think is useful about this thought experiment under ESSA is that this wouldn't exclude schools that would have otherwise been identified, because they're in this kind of triage land. And so it's more that these SQSS measures put schools into identification rather than take them out. And it's a way of putting weight on this that doesn't take away from the primacy of the academic indicators, which I think is the spirit of ESSA, wanting to keep that focus. Now, just to walk quickly through what this is, the schools that are identified as acute, there are 5% of schools that are acute on any number of these things. This is 0.4% in the acute category on suspension expulsion, 3.9% in chronic absenteeism, and culture climate, 1.1%. No additional schools in this analysis were identified with social emotional skills. So now I'm going to move on to a quick discussion about the identification of schools for targeted support and improvement. And the focus of our paper thus far has really been on comprehensive support, and this is a very brief kind of detour to explore some provisions of ESSA that we thought needed to have some light shined on them from a data and research perspective. But ESSA requires that, or stipulates in the draft regulations, that student subgroups within the schools, if they're performing at the 5% level of all students, have to be identified for targeted support and improvement. So to give you an example of what this means, if this is the threshold for bottom 5% of all students, in a particular school, you might have all students performing at this level, English language learners performing at this level, but your students with disabilities are performing at the bottom 5% level for all students. And what that indicates is that that school would be identified for targeted support. The subgroups that ESSA calls out specifically are economically disadvantaged students, students from major racial ethnic groups, children with disabilities, and English learners. And so what we wanted to show was the percentage of schools that might be identified under this provision. There's also another provision in the ESSA regulations that student subgroups that have been underperforming over several years should be identified for targeted support, but we don't touch that in this paper. So what we find is that for each, what we did is we looked at academic performance and graduation for each of these subgroups. And we used CORE's method of identifying the lowest performing racial ethnic group. So CORE measures performance for all of the subgroups, but then in the reporting just reports the lowest performing in that school on that measure. And so what we find is that for academic performance, an additional 13% of schools have their lowest performing racial ethnic group performing at the bottom 5%. That's 5% in graduation. And ultimately, aggregated across all of these different subgroups, what we see is that 69% of schools would be identified for targeted support and improvement based on academic performance, and then 31% of those would be identified based on graduation. And as you can see, this is largely driven by the students with disabilities, that students with disabilities in these schools at a subgroup size of 20, which is what's reported by the core districts, although 30 is what's required by ESSA, are identified in this bottom 5% for all students. So this is a really important finding, because if the federal government does really intend to support this number of schools, that's fantastic, and I'm all for it. I think they need it. But I think that there's reason to believe that that might not be their intention, and and so there's probably some careful revision that needs to go into the regulations on that dimension. So our recommendations, and then I'll want to hand it over to you guys for questions and for discussion. Our recommendations were really squarely focused at the ESSA regulations. We put this paper out with ESSA commentary on August 1st with other stakeholders in the state, and really wanted to make a point about the ESSA regulations. As you can see from the analysis we've laid out, there's still a lot that we can use here for state level policymaking, but our recommendations were, one, that we shouldn't require states to identify schools for CSI using a summative rating. We found that there were real trade-offs in different methods, and that ultimately that has to be a value judgment, and that value judgment should really be made by the states. So there's a good reason why a state could choose to use a summative rating, and there are also good reasons why a state could choose to use something like a tiered approach, and we felt that the regulations and the spirit of the statute were that those kind of decisions should be made by the states. The second definition is that the second recommendation is that we recommended that the ESSA should allow states to include the SQSS measures in the identification of schools for the reasons I discussed, which are that these SQSS measures, with no weight, they won't carry any attention. And also that if they were used in something like a tiered approach, it wouldn't do what they fear it would do, which is schools that are low on academic performance can have really good attendance and then kind of escape that identification, which is really the fear of including those in identification. So we recommended that there was thoughtful attention put to that. And then finally, that the TSI identification really needs to be fixed to not identify the vast majority of schools, or that the federal government should be prepared to support the vast majority of schools. And then just a couple of comments on what we think is needed from here. I mean, the policy trade-offs that we explored are not exhaustive by any means, and they really are a proof of concept. To get from this proof of concept to policy, states should really undertake the kind of empirical analysis that we, in partnership with the core districts, have done. Because what you see when you put data to these different policy approaches is really clearly how your values are being laid out and what some of the unintended consequences might be. And until you put the data and the measures to it, you just don't see it in the same way. It's discussion until there's evidence. This includes, we think that there's a lot of further exploration that could be done here. We only barely touched on subgroup performance. That's something that could use a much more in-depth treatment, specifically in the tiered approach. Also, exploring a little bit more concretely these different weighting schemes and the creation of the summative score using multiple years of data instead of just 1 year, which could get away from some of the concerns that being acutely low on one measure in just 1 year could be an anomaly. And testing the operationalization of every single metric. So this is another thing we didn't talk about here, but there's a lot of value judgment in the ways that you define each metric, how you define your growth model, how you define academic performance, whether it's proficiency or improvement on a scale score. And there's a lot of research that's active right now trying to answer those questions.